I used to think silence meant peace, but sometimes silence is just the sound of people giving up on you. My name is Ava, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people whisper about, but never really understand. The kind who sits quietly at family gatherings, pretending not to hear the jokes that sound too much like truth. They say I walked away from everything good, my husband, my church, my community, but no one ever asked what I was walking toward. Atlanta never sleeps, and neither did I back then. I worked double shifts, smiled through rumors, and prayed that one day my story would make sense, not to them, but to me. People saw my choices as rebellion, but what they didn't see was the woman trying to survive inside her own skin. I grew up in a neighborhood where family ties were everything. You didn't step out of line, you didn't question the rules. And I questioned everything. Not out of disrespect, but because I felt trapped. My mother was a saint in the eyes of everyone else, but at home she was fragile, bitter, and wrapped in her own fears. My father had been gone for years, leaving me with the memory of a man who promised safety but delivered silence. By the time I turned 22, I had learned one unshakable truth. If I wanted to breathe, I would have to do it alone. I remember the night I told my family I wanted to leave the church choir. It wasn't just a decision about singing. It was about stepping out of a life that felt suffocating. My grandmother, her hands trembling over her Bible, looked at me like I had committed a crime. "Ava, this isn't who you are," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized no one would see the real me unless I showed them anyway. That night, I didn't cry. I walked home in silence, letting the rain wash away the weight of their disappointment. I felt like a stranger in my own life. And maybe I was. Leaving the choir wasn't the end. It was the first of many small acts of defiance, each one making the whispers louder. "She's selfish," they said. "She doesn't care about the family." Every time I heard it, I felt the pull of their judgment, heavy on my chest. But each time I reminded myself, my life belonged to me, not to their expectations. I remember staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror of my childhood bedroom, asking myself who I was supposed to be. The world outside demanded perfection, a kind of flawless facade, but inside, I was messy, scared, and full of dreams no one seemed to care about. I wanted to write. I wanted to travel. I wanted freedom. But family loyalty was a chain, invisible yet unbreakable. Every choice I made felt like betrayal. Every step forward was met with silence or anger. And yet, despite it all, I kept moving because moving was the only way I could feel alive. I found solace in the little things: my apartment above a quiet street, the smell of fresh coffee in the mornings, the comfort of a book that understood me better than any relative ever could. I worked as a freelance writer, piecing together stories for strangers while trying to untangle my own life story. But community gossip has a way of reaching even the quietest corners. One evening, a neighbor stopped me outside the grocery store. "You're abandoning everyone," she said, voice sharp. "How can you be so selfish?" I wanted to scream, to tell her she didn't know me at all. But instead, I smiled politely, nodded, and walked away. Because by that point, I had learned the most important lesson. Your peace is worth more than anyone else's approval. Some nights I would sit on my balcony and replay my life in my mind. The arguments with my mother, the disapproving looks at family dinners, the isolation that felt like both a punishment and a liberation. I thought about the people I loved who didn't understand me, and for a long time, that hurt more than any words ever could. And yet, in the quiet moments,
I began to see something else: strength. The kind of quiet, uncelebrated strength that builds inside you when you keep standing, even when everyone else turns away.
It was the summer of my 28th birthday. I had returned home for one night, against my better judgment, because family still mattered to me in ways I couldn't articulate. I walked into the kitchen, where my aunts and cousins were gathered, and felt the familiar sting of judgment in every glance. "You're living alone now?" my cousin whispered. "Yes," I said softly, "and I'm happy." There was a pause, like the air itself held its breath. "You're different," she finally said, almost accusingly. "Yes," I admitted, "and I've learned to love myself anyway." The silence that followed was deafening, but I felt a strange liberation. I didn't need them to understand me. I just needed to be me. Writing became my sanctuary. Each story I typed out, each memory I poured onto the page, was a way of speaking the truth I couldn't say aloud. I wrote about love and betrayal, joy and heartbreak, the tiny victories of surviving each day. And slowly, I realized my story mattered, not because anyone else believed it, but because it had saved me from disappearing entirely. One evening, I finally confronted my mother. I had avoided it for years, fearing the fight, fearing the tears, but the weight of unspoken words was too heavy. "I feel like you don't see me," I said, voice trembling. "You're not the daughter I raised," she replied, tears welling in her eyes. "I am who I am," I said. "I've tried to live your way, your rules, your expectations, and I broke under it, but I am still standing." We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile fully, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a moment where I felt seen. And that, even if just a little, was enough. I left Atlanta that morning for work, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. The city still slept, unaware of the battles I had fought silently, unaware of the quiet victories of a woman who had been judged and still chose to rise. People will always talk, will always cast their judgments, and sometimes the people you love the most will misunderstand you. But freedom comes from living for yourself even when it's lonely. I met Jada for coffee that morning. She's the kind of friend who doesn't ask questions, who listens without judgment. We sat across from each other, and I told her everything I hadn't said to anyone else: the family tensions, the whispered criticisms, the nights I felt like I was drowning in other people's expectations. Jada reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're brave," she said. "Most people never find the courage to be themselves. You're surviving and thriving." That day, I realized the power of small victories. Every email sent, every story written, every time I chose myself over the opinions of others, those were victories. Quiet ones, maybe invisible to the outside world, but they mattered to me. I remembered the nights I cried in my bedroom, wondering if I'd ever belong anywhere. I would stare at the ceiling, imagining a life where I could make mistakes and still be loved, where my choices didn't make people shake their heads. Now, years later, I understood something. Belonging doesn't always come from family or community. Sometimes it comes from within, from choosing yourself, from accepting that your life, your truth, is enough. The streets of Atlanta were quiet that evening. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows. I thought about all the times I had doubted myself, all the times I had felt too much, too loud, or too different. And yet, here I was, standing, breathing, surviving.
Some nights, I cook dinner for myself and sit quietly at the table. No one tells me what to do, no one criticizes the way I live. It's simple, ordinary, but it feels like victory. Every small choice to live authentically is a rebellion in a world that constantly expects conformity. Journaling became more than a habit. It became therapy. I wrote letters I never sent, apologies I didn't owe, stories of heartbreak and joy, and slowly stitched together a life that made sense to me. Fear had been my companion for years. Fear of judgment, fear of loneliness, fear of failing. But I realized fear isn't a stop sign. It's a guide. It tells you what matters most. It points to what you must face to grow. I stood there, looking at the skyline, the lights flickering like tiny promises. I thought about all the people who doubted me, all the times I had been called selfish, reckless, or lost. And I realized being misunderstood doesn't erase your truth. It only makes it yours. When I got my first freelance paycheck, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not pride in wealth, but pride in the fact that I had carved a space for myself, that I had built a life by my own hands, by my own choices. Some days, the ache for family still hits me. I wonder if they ever think of me, if they regret the harsh words, the unspoken resentments. And sometimes I allow myself to feel that sadness fully. Because acknowledging the pain doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. I've built my own family now, friends who see me, who celebrate my victories, who comfort me in my defeats. And slowly I learned that chosen family can be just as powerful, just as real as the family you're born into.